Hey, it's Luke. Today we're looking at 5 mistakes that new Ableton Live users make, and I give you a solution for each one of them. Even if you've been using Ableton Live for a while, you might not know about some of these, so I'm glad you're here. Okay, let's get started. Number 1 is leaving the warp mode on beats. Now this is for non-beat content. If you're using it for a drum loop, that might be the best one. But when you load a sample, most of the time, the warp mode here will be beats, and there are these other options here. Each option has its own use, but if you leave it on beats and you've got, let's say, a vocal sample, and you're trying to adjust the speed, it'll sound really choppy. So you might want to go to one of these other ones. Complex and Complex Pro are the most advanced ones. They use up more CPU, but they do a really good job. You might want to check these other ones. Tones will be useful for things like vocals or basses that have just one sound. Texture is good for pads. You'll want to try the different warp modes and see how they work for your particular sample, but don't leave it just on beats mode. If it starts to sound crunchy or choppy, you'll know that's where the problem is. Oh, and I just found out that the Complex and Complex Pro warp modes are available in the intro version now as of Ableton Live 10. So if you've got an older version, they may not show up, but if you've got one of the new versions, you should be able to use those. Okay, the second mistake a lot of new users make is not turning this off here. Create fades on clip edges. And the reason you want this to be off is when you have it on, when you bring a sample in, you can sort of tell that first kick is just a little bit more quiet. And I'll show you why. If we go into arrangement mode here and turn this on, you can tell there's a fade here at the beginning. So that first transient is basically getting cut out. You can go manually and just move it over, and then it hits the same way the other ones do. But that's not ideal, and you don't want to be doing that all the time. So if you go into your settings and go under Record, Warp, and Launch, just turn this off. What you'll need to do is close out Ableton completely. Okay, now that we're back in Ableton Live, Create Fades on Clip Edges is off, which is what we want. So if we bring a drum loop into here and just hit play, you can tell that first one is just acting normally. If you did want the fades on, because the whole reason that option is in there is that in theory, it should do the fades at the beginning and the end, so you won't end up with clicks. And that could be useful sometimes, but you don't want it in there all the time, especially with things that have a transient at the beginning where it cuts it off like we saw. But if you did want that fade in there for some reason, you can just click fade if you're using the session view here. So you can tell it's making that sound. That first one is a little bit lower. And if you're using it in arrangement view, it would have had a little fade here if you had the option on. Now that we have it off, it shows up like this, but you can still do your fade if you want to manually. If you can't see the fades at the beginning and the end, there are 2 things you have to check. You have to make sure that this button here is off, and you have to make sure this one is off as well. For this one here, you can just hit the letter A and it'll turn it on and off. You just make sure it's off where you've got your fades. You can do what you need to do. And then you can hit the letter A again, and that'll put you back in automation mode, but you might not be using that at all because as a beginner, automation just seems so complicated. I can do a video specifically about automation if you want. Just let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Okay, number 3 is not using the tab key, and it's a lot more useful than you think. When I first started out with Ableton Live, I was having a tough time with the session view here with the clips, and just hitting the tab key was this magical moment where all of a sudden it just looks like a normal DAW. So if you've worked in something else before and you're having a little bit of a tough time getting used to Ableton Live, just hit that tab key and it'll make a huge difference. I did a video earlier about how I started with Ableton Live, and that tab key was a big part of it. I'll link it here or here, somewhere up there. So the tab key on its own will switch you between this arrangement view and the session view. But also if you hit Shift and Tab at the same time, what it'll do is it'll switch between these 2 down here. So right now I don't have any effects. Let's add I'll just add a filter, an auto pan, and maybe a compressor. So now that we've got these, if you hit Shift and Tab, the bottom will switch between those 2. So if you need to do some edits to your clip itself, you can adjust the pitch and do whatever you need to do. Then you hit Shift Tab and you can go deal with the effects. It just saves you some time moving around with the mouse or your trackpad. Another thing you can do is if you want to take your clips from session view to arrangement view or the other way around, you can click on the clip, start dragging it, and then hit tab, and then it'll bring you into your arrangement view, and then you can let it go. So it's a lot easier to move stuff around. Which brings us to number 4, not using the shortcuts. Okay, let's face it, remembering the shortcuts can be a lot of work. But here's the thing, they make things so much faster. You don't have to learn them all at once. By learning and using the shortcuts for the things you do the most often, it's going to help you move from beginner to intermediate a lot more quickly. Because instead of doing this, create MIDI track, I want to create 6 tracks, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can just do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's done. So you'll have more time to spend in the DAW doing other things. Some useful ones to get you started are like the one I just did, where you can do Command T or Control T if you're on Windows, and that creates a new audio track. Or if you do Command Shift, you just add Shift to that, it creates a new MIDI track. So those are really useful to have. If you want to duplicate anything, let's say we have this melody here, you can do Command A for select all, and Command D, which will duplicate it as many times as you want. That'll work for audio, it'll work for MIDI, it'll work for tracks, it works for a whole bunch of stuff. If you have your melody here and you want a pause, you can just select them. You hit 0 on your number pad or the regular 0 key on your keyboard, and it'll deactivate those notes, which is really nice because you can deactivate them, keep playing around with them, and it sort of keeps them on standby if you want to bring them back in later. Another useful one, and probably the most useful, is make sure you're using the spacebar to start and stop. You don't want to have to go up here and hit play and stop every time. But one thing you'll notice is every time we hit play, it goes back to the beginning. If you want to keep playing from where you are, you can just hit Shift as you hit play, and it'll keep playing from where you stopped, which is sort of nice to have, especially on a track. If you want to make a couple changes and then just keep going from where you were, you don't want to start back at the beginning every time. That's the way to do it. So the next time you're working in Ableton Live, try to notice the things that you do really often, make a note, and then learn the shortcuts for those to get started, and then work on learning the other ones as time goes. Okay, number 5 is not choosing a place for your sound library and then sticking to it. It can be a mess to start moving stuff around, so it's a good idea to decide where you'll put it and just leave it there. If you have to move it at some point, it's not a huge deal. Ableton has a search feature where it'll look for the missing sounds, but that can become a bit of a hassle, especially when you have a lot of projects. If you do know that you're going to be moving it around at some point though, instead of doing save, you can go here to collect all and save. And what that'll do is when it saves your project, it'll save all of the samples that you're using inside that project folder. So if you open that up later, even if you've moved the files, they'll still be in your project and you'll be able to work as if nothing happened. This does take a little bit more storage space because you're making a copy of the files that you have already, but a lot of people say it's saved them a whole lot of work down the road. Okay, I hope those can help you make some great music better and faster in Ableton Live. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.